Dan Reed loved a good joke, especially when it was at the expense of internet myths. As the co-host of the popular podcast Digital Myths Debunked, his weekly mission was to take the web's creepiest legends and tear them apart with logic and humor. Haunted emails, cursed videos, killer memes, none of it fazed him. To Dan, it was all just modern folklore for the gullible and bored. "It's always the same story," he'd joke. "Someone sees something creepy, gets a warning, ignores it, and then bam. They're cursed for life. People eat that stuff up." His co-host Alex often played devil's advocate, half seriously pointing out that some urban legends had real-world roots. "Come on, Dan. You don't think even a tiny bit of it could be true," she teased during one episode. Dan scoffed. "If there's one thing I've learned doing this podcast, it's that the scariest thing on the internet isn't ghosts or curses, it's bad Photoshop." That week's episode was about smile.jpg, one of the internet's most infamous cursed images. The photo allegedly showed a husky with a grotesque, human-like grin, its teeth unnaturally large and perfect. According to the legend, anyone who viewed the image would be plagued by horrific nightmares and hallucinations until they shared it with someone else, or worse, until they succumbed to madness. "Let me guess," Dan said mockingly into the microphone. "It's like every other creepypasta, right? Don't open the email, don't click the attachment, or the big bad smiling dog will get you." The two laughed, riffing on the absurdity of it all. "Honestly, though," Alex added, "it's kind of creepy, right? I mean, that grin? It's unnerving." Dan waved her off. "Sure, if you're scared of a poorly edited dog photo. I'd set it as my desktop background if it weren't so pixelated." The episode ended like most others, with Dan declaring the story debunked and Alex playing along. Their listeners loved the banter, and for Dan, the episode was just another notch on his belt. But later that evening, as he reviewed their recording for edits, an odd feeling settled over him, a strange unease he couldn't shake. When Dan logged into the podcast's email account the next morning, he found dozens of messages from listeners, many of them sharing stories about their own strange encounters with smile.jpg. He read them with mild amusement until one email in particular caught his attention. The subject line read, "You're next." Dan chuckled. "Good one," he muttered, opening the message. The email was blank, save for an attachment labeled smile.jpg. Rolling his eyes, Dan clicked the file, expecting to see the infamous image and get a good laugh. The screen loaded slowly, the cursor spinning lazily as if to mock him. When the image finally appeared, it looked just as ridiculous as he remembered, a husky with an unnervingly human grin, its sharp teeth unnaturally bright. The colors were washed out, the resolution grainy, but something about the eyes stopped Dan in his tracks. They weren't just part of the photo. They seemed to watch him, their depth unnatural, like they knew something he didn't. He shook it off, closing the image with a dismissive laugh. People are so easy to scare. But that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Dan couldn't stop seeing that grin. Every time he closed his eyes, the image reappeared in his mind, vivid and sharp, as if it had been burned into his memory. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, something felt off. Dan didn't believe in curses. Not then. But belief isn't always required for something to be real. The following morning, Dan woke to a familiar ping on his phone. A new email had arrived, flagged as urgent. The subject line read, "Open if you dare." Dan rolled his eyes, sitting up in bed. "Probably some fan with a Photoshop joke," he muttered as he clicked the email open. The message was blank save for an attachment labeled smile.jpg. He smirked. Of course, someone had sent it. He was half tempted to bring it up on the next episode, maybe roast the sender for trying to scare him. Without a second thought, he tapped the file. The screen took a moment to load, but when it did, he felt a brief shiver, not from fear, but from the sheer strangeness of the image. A husky stared back at him, but its grin wasn't natural. Its teeth were human, slightly too large for its mouth, and its eyes held a malevolence that made his stomach churn. Something about the angle of its head, the unnatural sharpness of the image, felt wrong. Dan quickly dismissed the unease. "Nice try," he said aloud, closing the image and tossing his phone on the nightstand. But when he glanced at the screen again, the grin from the image seemed to linger in his mind like an afterimage burned into his retinas. By noon, the email had already slipped his mind. The rest of the day was spent editing the podcast and prepping for their next recording session. It wasn't until late that evening, as he sat in his home office, that the first incident occurred. Dan was in the middle of researching another internet urban legend when his screen suddenly went black. He frowned, tapping the keyboard, but the monitor didn't respond. Then, without warning, it flickered back to life, but the browser he'd been using was gone. Instead, the image of the husky stared back at him, its grin wider now, its teeth sharper. "What the hell?" Dan muttered. He tried closing the window, but it wouldn't respond. The cursor froze, and then the image began to move. The husky tilted its head, slowly at first, then unnaturally far, the bones of its neck crunching in jerky, distorted movements. Its grin stretched further, as though the flesh of its face were tearing to accommodate the sinister smile. Dan yanked the power cord from the monitor. The screen went dark, but the grin remained in his mind's eye, vivid and unervingly detailed. "Glitchy virus," he told himself. "That's all it is. Some asshole sent me a corrupted file." But his voice wavered, and deep down, a seed of doubt began to take root. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the husky's grin, its teeth gleaming in the darkness. By the time the sun rose, Dan felt like a ghost of himself. His usual morning coffee did little to shake the lingering dread that clung to him. He had planned to call Alex to share the strange events, but he stopped himself. What would he even say? That an internet meme had rattled him. She'd never let him live it down. Pushing the unease aside, Dan headed to his recording studio, determined to focus on the podcast. As he entered the room, he noticed something strange. His laptop, which he was certain he'd left closed, was open, its screen faintly glowing. When he approached, the glowing screen flickered, and text appeared in jagged, red font, "Smile with me." Dan recoiled, his pulse pounding in his ears. He closed the laptop with a snap, but the words felt seared into his brain. Taking a deep breath, he decided to reinstall the operating system. "That'll wipe out any virus," he muttered, trying to convince himself this was still just a tech issue. As the progress bar crawled across the screen, Dan stepped into the kitchen for a glass of water. The faint hum of the laptop's fan followed him, a constant background noise that seemed to grow louder the longer he ignored it. When he returned, the laptop screen had gone black again. Relief washed over him until the screen lit up, showing the husky's face once more. This time, the grin was impossibly wide, splitting the sides of its face. Blood dripped from its jaws, the crimson liquid smearing the edges of the screen as though the image itself were bleeding. Dan slammed the laptop shut and shoved it aside, his heart racing. He could no longer deny it. This was no ordinary meme. Something was wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong. For the next few hours, Dan avoided his devices entirely. No phones, no laptops, not even the TV. But as the night stretched on, he began to hear it, faint scratching sounds, coming from behind the walls. At first, he thought it was mice, but the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like claws dragging against wood in slow, deliberate strokes. Then came the whispers. They started faint, unintelligible, but soon Dan could make out words. "Smile." The voice hissed. It's your turn. Dan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the darkened corners of his room. The whispers had stopped for now, but the suffocating weight of the silence felt worse. Every creak of the wooden floor, every distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed unnaturally loud, each sound amplified by his strained nerves. He grabbed his phone to call Alex, his co-host and someone he trusted. The dial tone rang once, then twice, before her groggy voice answered. Dan? It's late. What's wrong? Her voice was tinged with concern, but she was clearly half asleep. Dan hesitated. What could he even say? That an internet image was stalking him? He settled for a half-truth. Have you gotten any weird emails? About smile.jpg. No, Alex replied, her voice now more alert. Why? Did you get one? Yeah. Someone sent it to me yesterday. I opened it, and weird stuff is happening. Alex was quiet for a moment. Weird like how? Your computer acting up. Dan exhaled sharply. Not just that. The image, it keeps showing up on my screen, even when I'm offline. And there's more. Sounds. Whispers. Like it's he stopped, unsure of how to explain the sensation of being watched without sounding insane. Dan, you sound off, Alex said carefully. Maybe you need some rest. We've been working non-stop, and I'm not imagining this, he snapped, louder than intended. He immediately softened. Sorry. I don't know what's happening. Alex hesitated. Okay, listen. If you're really freaked out, shut everything down. Unplug your devices. Take a break. I'll come over tomorrow, and we'll figure it out, okay? Dan agreed reluctantly, ending the call. But even as he sat there in the dark, the uneasy feeling persisted. The whispers weren't gone. They were waiting. By the time morning came, Dan felt like a shell of himself. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the night over and over. Determined to regain control, he decided to take Alex's advice. He unplugged his laptop, powered off his phone, and even disconnected the smart TV in the living room. For the first time in days, the house was silent. Dan allowed himself to breathe. Maybe it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. Around noon, the calm was shattered. As Dan stood in the kitchen, brewing his third cup of coffee, he heard a faint click. It came from the living room. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he walked toward the sound, stopping just outside the doorway. The TV, which he'd unplugged, was on. The screen flickered with static, and the air around him grew cold. Dan's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer. At first, the screen showed nothing but the chaotic black and white noise of an untuned signal. Then, shapes began to form within the static, distorted lines that coalesced into the image of the husky. Its grin was wider than before, its teeth sharp and glistening. Dan stumbled back, his coffee cup shattering on the floor. The husky tilted its head, its motion jerky, as if the screen struggled to contain it. And then, it spoke. Why did you laugh at me? The voice was low, distorted, and filled with an eerie echo that seemed to reverberate through the room. Dan's legs trembled as he backed away, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the screen. The husky's eyes locked onto his, its grin stretching impossibly wider. The screen flickered again, and the image was replaced by a live feed of Dan's living room. The camera angle was from behind him. Dan whipped around, but the room was empty. When he turned back to the TV, the screen was black. His reflection stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed, with one horrifying addition behind him. The faint outline of a shadow loomed, its shape too animal-like to be human. Dan paced the room, his mind racing. The shadow he thought he'd seen in the reflection haunted him. Every corner of the house felt like it was hiding something, some unseen force waiting to pounce. He turned on all the lights, desperate to chase away the oppressive darkness. Grabbing his phone, he hesitated. Who could he call? Alex wouldn't believe him, not fully. The authorities? He could already imagine the conversation explaining how a cursed image had invaded his home. The idea was ludicrous, even to him. A faint knock broke the silence. Dan's head snapped toward the front door. The knock came again, deliberate and slow. His gut twisted with dread. He hadn't ordered anything, wasn't expecting anyone. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his ears. Peering through the peephole, he saw no one. The street was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlights. Just as he let out a relieved breath, another knock echoed, this time louder. Dan flung open the door, anger masking his fear. Who's there? The porch was empty. He stepped outside, scanning the quiet street. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves and the hum of distant traffic. Then, from behind him, the door creaked shut. He spun around, but the house was still, the door slightly ajar. As he stepped back inside, the whispers returned soft, almost playful. Smile for me, they urged, overlapping and faint. Dan's blood ran cold. He slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as if to block out the sounds. But the whispers grew louder, seeping into the walls. Then, they stopped, replaced by a single, slow laugh. It wasn't his. Sleep became impossible. Dan spent the night sitting on the couch, every light in the house blazing, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. The TV remained unplugged, the laptop shoved into a drawer. Yet the oppressive feeling of being watched persisted, stronger than ever. As dawn approached, Dan noticed something strange. The mirrors in the house, all of them, seemed off. The reflections were delayed, lagging by a fraction of a second. When he moved his hand in front of one, the reflection hesitated before following suit. Testing his theory, he leaned closer to the hallway mirror. His reflection stared back, its eyes dull and lifeless. Dan waved, but the reflection didn't move. It just stared. Then, slowly, the reflection's grin stretched unnaturally wide, the corners of its mouth tearing, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. Dan stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. When he looked again, the mirror was normal. His own pale, terrified face stared back at him. The whispers returned that evening, louder than before, filling every corner of the house. They came from the vents, the cupboards, even the electrical sockets. Dan tried to drown them out with music, but the speakers only echoed the whispers back to him. As the clock struck midnight, his phone vibrated on the table. A notification popped up, new message from unknown sender. With shaking hands, he opened it. The text read, "Let me in." Dan dropped the phone, his chest tight with fear. The whispers stopped, and the house fell into an eerie silence. Then, a faint scratching began at the front door. Dan sat motionless, staring at the front door as the scratching grew louder. It wasn't frantic, it was slow, deliberate, as though whatever was outside knew he was listening. His breathing was shallow, his hands gripping the edges of the couch until his knuckles turned white. "Let me in," a voice whispered faintly, as if carried by the wind. It wasn't coming from the door. It came from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the very air around him. Dan's mind raced. He wanted to believe it was a hallucination, the result of stress and lack of sleep. But every fiber of his being told him this was real as the cold sweat running down his back. Summoning his courage, he stood and crept toward the door. The scratching stopped. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely a whisper. Silence. Just as he reached the door, the lights in the house flickered. The overhead bulb in the entryway buzzed loudly, then popped, plunging him into darkness. His phone's flashlight was the only source of light now, its beam weak and shaky in his trembling hand. The scratching resumed, but this time it was behind him. Dan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned around, the flashlight's beam cutting through the shadows. There was nothing there. Relief washed over him for a split second until he noticed the faint outline of something in the reflection of the hallway mirror. The husky. It stood just beyond the edges of the light, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its grin impossibly wide. Dan whipped around, but the hallway was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the husky was gone. A loud bang echoed through the house. Dan nearly dropped his phone as he turned toward the sound. It came from the living room. The TV, still unplugged, had turned on again. The static on the screen was faint, flickering as if struggling to hold its signal. Steeling himself, Dan stepped into the room. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and chaotic. His eyes locked onto the TV screen, where the static began to shift. Shapes emerged, forming the same grinning husky he'd seen before. Its head tilted toward him, and for the first time, its mouth moved. "Why did you let me in?" it hissed. Dan stumbled back, his phone clattering to the floor. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the image on the screen dissolved into chaotic static. Then, everything went still. The following days passed in a blur. Dan stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He couldn't leave the house. Something inside him told him it wouldn't let him. He'd tried once, stepping outside into the daylight, only to feel a suffocating pressure dragging him back. The world outside seemed distorted, warped, as though it no longer belonged to him. The whispers had stopped, but they were replaced by something worse, laughter. It echoed through the house at random intervals, faint and mocking. It came from the vents, the walls, and sometimes, directly behind him. His phone continued to buzz with messages from the unknown sender. Each one was more cryptic than the last. "Do you see me yet? You shouldn't have laughed. Smile." He stopped opening them. It didn't matter. The messages would appear on his laptop screen, his TV, even scribbled in the condensation on the bathroom mirror. One night, as Dan sat hunched in his kitchen, staring at his untouched plate of food, the laughter grew louder. It was no longer faint, it was here, in the room with him. He turned his head slowly and saw it. The husky sat in the corner, its form faintly flickering like a glitch in reality. Its head tilted back, and the sound of its laughter filled the room. It didn't move closer, didn't attack. It just watched, its grin splitting its face as the room seemed to warp around it. Dan squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling. "You're not real. You're not real," he whispered to himself. But when he opened his eyes, the husky was standing inches away, its teeth gleaming in the dim light. "Smile," it whispered. Dan screamed, falling backward as the lights in the house went out. The blackout plunged Dan into complete darkness. The air grew colder, and the laughter, once faint and mocking, now roared through the house, surrounding him like a storm. Scrambling to his feet, Dan fumbled for his phone, the weak glow of its flashlight casting long, unnatural shadows across the walls. The husky was gone. Or maybe it had never been there. Dan wasn't sure anymore. His thoughts were fractured, his grip on reality slipping. The whispers returned, faint but steady, circling him like predators. "Why fight it? It's already begun." Dan's phone buzzed in his hand, the vibration jolting him. A new notification lit up the screen. It was another message from the unknown sender. "Let's play a game." Before he could process the words, the screen flickered and went black. Then, slowly, it lit up again, displaying a single word: "Run." At that moment, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from upstairs. Dan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Someone or something was in the house with him. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, as if whatever was upstairs wanted him to hear every step. "Who's there?" Dan shouted, his voice shaking. The only response was a soft chuckle, followed by a voice low, guttural, and impossible to locate. "You wanted to laugh at me. Now, I laugh at you." The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. Dan's instincts screamed at him to move, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. When the sound reached the base of the staircase, the house fell silent. The oppressive quiet was worse than the noise. "Smile," the voice whispered, directly behind him. Dan spun around, his flashlight beam darting wildly. There was nothing there. But the moment he turned back, he saw it. On the wall before him, written in a dark, viscous substance, were the words, "Look up." Against every instinct, Dan obeyed. Above him, clinging to the ceiling like a grotesque spider, was the husky. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, its eyes glowing with malevolence. It tilted its head, the movement jerky and unnatural, before lunging toward him. Dan woke on the floor of his living room, his head pounding and his body trembling. He didn't remember blacking out, but the ache in his chest and the cold sweat covering his skin told him it hadn't been a dream. He sat up slowly, wincing at the sharp pain in his neck. The house was eerily quiet again. Too quiet. Every sound he made, his breathing, the creak of the floor beneath him, felt amplified in the stillness. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. With shaking hands, he reached for it, dread pooling in his stomach. Another message had appeared. "It's almost over." Dan's hands trembled as he read the words. He didn't know what it was, but every fiber of his being told him he wouldn't survive it. He needed help. He needed to leave the house. But every time he tried, some invisible force seemed to pull him back, like the air itself was conspiring against him. He decided to try one last time. Grabbing his keys, he bolted for the front door. As he reached it, the lights in the house flickered violently. The door, which had been closed, suddenly swung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The world outside was gone, replaced by an endless void. Dan stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The laughter returned, louder than ever, echoing from every direction. The husky appeared in the doorway, its form shifting and glitching as if it were struggling to stay tethered to reality. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "This is what you wanted," it said, its voice layered with malice. "You wanted to mock me. Now, you're mine." Dan backed away, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. The husky tilted its head, its grin widening. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you took. Your laughter, your mockery, those are mine now." Before Dan could respond, the lights in the house exploded, plunging everything into total darkness. The whispers surrounded him, overlapping and deafening, until they formed a single word. Smile. Weeks after Dan's disappearance, Alex sat alone in their recording studio, her fingers drumming anxiously against the desk. Dan hadn't returned her calls, hadn't shown up for work, and hadn't updated any of their shared accounts. The last thing she heard from him was his strange, panicked question about smile.jpg, and now the memory of that conversation gnawed at her. At first, she'd assumed he'd gone off the grid, maybe taking a break from the podcast or dealing with personal issues. But when days turned into weeks with no word, she couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was terribly wrong. She had gone to his house only to find it abandoned. No sign of Dan, no belongings missing, no evidence that he'd planned to leave. The place felt hollow, as though even the air had been drained of its vitality. The police were no help. "People disappear all the time," the officer had said dismissively, his tone implying it wasn't worth pursuing. "No signs of foul play. He's probably just taking time off." But Alex couldn't accept that. She knew Dan. He wouldn't just vanish without a word. Something had happened to him, something connected to that cursed image he'd been so desperate to discuss. Now, sitting in the studio where they'd shared countless hours of laughter and banter, Alex decided to do what Dan would have done, dig deeper. She pulled out her laptop, logged into their shared server, and opened the folder containing the raw files from their last few episodes. Everything seemed normal at first, the files labeled with their usual timestamps and topics. But then, at the bottom of the folder, she noticed an unfamiliar file. It was titled Smile.mp3. Her stomach dropped. She didn't remember Dan ever mentioning this file, and the name sent a chill down her spine. Hesitating for a moment, she clicked on it. The file began to play, the first few seconds filled with the familiar sound of Dan's voice. Alright, welcome back to Digital Myths Debunked. Today, we're diving into one of the internet's creepiest urban legends, Smile.jpg. Alex felt a pang of sadness hearing his voice, but the relief was short-lived. As the recording played, Dan's voice began to distort. It slowed, deepened, until it no longer sounded human. Then, static erupted, loud and grating, forcing Alex to rip her headphones off. She stared at the screen, her heart racing, as a faint sound emerged from the noise. Laughter. It wasn't Dan's laugh. It was guttural, mocking, and disturbingly layered, as though multiple voices were laughing at once. The sound grew louder, more invasive, filling the room. Alex frantically clicked to stop the file, but the controls were unresponsive. Her laptop screen flickered, and then the file closed on its own. For a moment, silence returned. Alex sat frozen, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. Then, a notification popped up on her screen. It was an email, sent from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Play it again." She stared at the email, dread pooling in her stomach. Another notification appeared, this time a message from her own podcast account. It wasn't possible. Dan was the only other person with access, and his account had been inactive since his disappearance. The message was simple. "Do you see me yet?" Alex's throat went dry. Her hand hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. The studio lights flickered, and a faint scratching sound filled the room, coming from behind her. She froze, too terrified to turn around. Then came the whisper. "Smile." Alex whipped around, but the room was empty. The sound stopped, leaving her in oppressive silence. She backed toward the door, her hand fumbling for the light switch. Just as her fingers brushed the wall, her laptop screen flickered back to life. The image of the husky filled the screen, its grotesque grin wider than anything she could have imagined. Blood dripped from its teeth, pooling at the bottom of the frame. Its eyes locked onto hers, glowing with a sinister light. Before she could react, text appeared beneath the image, one word at a time. "You're next." Alex slammed the laptop shut and bolted from the studio, her heart pounding. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. She pulled out her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but as soon as she unlocked it, the image of the husky stared back at her from the screen. Her phone vibrated in her hand. A new notification appeared, and with trembling fingers, she opened it. The message read, "Let me in." Alex screamed, the phone slipping from her grasp. She stumbled backward, but no matter where she turned, the feeling of being watched persisted. Shadows shifted in the corners of her vision, and the faint sound of laughter followed her into the night.